Dr. Bryan, you're an expert on nitric oxide. First of all, let's talk about the difference between nitric and nitrous oxide, because they sound a lot alike, but they're completely different, aren't they?
They are, and more times than not, people mistake
Mhm.
nitric oxide for nitrous oxide. They're completely different molecules, although similarly, nitric oxide is one nitrogen, one oxygen. Nitrous oxide is two nitrogen, one oxygen. And nitrous oxide is actually the anesthetic you get when you go to the dentist office, and it's completely different chemistry and physiology than nitric oxide.
So nitrous is the laughing gas,
Exactly.
with it more commonly referred to.
Right.
Doctor, why does your body need nitric oxide?
Well, it's probably one of the most important molecules